What if I told you that the best thing that ever happened to a woman was the day she lost absolutely everything? Not some things, not most things, everything. Her home, her savings, her marriage of 27 years, her business, her identity. All of it gone inside of 6 weeks. At 55 years old, with nothing but a duffel bag, a sleeping bag, and a mind full of grief she didn't know how to carry, Margaret Elaine Calloway drove her 12-year-old pickup truck to the edge of a forest in rural Tennessee and sat there in the dark for 3 hours before she finally got out. She didn't have a plan. She didn't have a destination. She had $38, a box of crackers, and the kind of silence that only comes after your entire world has caved in. But here's what you need to know about Margaret. Here's the part that made her different from every other person who has ever sat at the edge of something terrifying and turned back. Margaret didn't turn back. She walked into those woods. And what she built in there, with her bare hands, with no money, with no help, through a brutal Tennessee winter, didn't just save her life. It changed it so completely, so permanently, so profoundly, that by the time she walked back out of those woods a year later, she was a different woman. A wealthier woman. Not just in money, though the money came too, but wealthy in every way that actually matters. This is her story. And if you're going through something right now, if you feel like the ground has shifted under your feet and you don't know how to stand, I need you to stay with me until the end. Because what Margaret learned in those woods, she wants you to know too. Margaret was born in Clarksville, Tennessee in 1968, the second of 4 children, raised in a house where love was plentiful, but money was not. Her father worked at a tire plant. Her mother took in laundry and alterations. They were the kind of family where you fixed things instead of replacing them, where you ate everything on your plate because wasting food was a sin, and where you understood from a very young age that nothing in this life comes without work. Margaret carried that with her. She carried it into school, where she was the girl who stayed late to help the teacher clean the classroom. She carried it into her first job at 16, working the register at a diner 6 mornings a week before the school bell rang. And she carried it into her marriage at 26 to a man named David, who was tall and easy smiling, and who told her on their 3rd date that he had never met anyone who worked as hard as she did. David was a contractor. Margaret had, by that point, turned her passion for cooking into a small catering business operating out of the church kitchen 3 towns over. Together, they built something, slowly, deliberately, the way people from that part of Tennessee know how to build things, brick by brick, year by year, without rushing. By the time Margaret was 45, the catering business had grown into a full events company. She employed 11 people. She had a beautiful farmhouse on 4 acres outside of Nashville. Her children, 2 daughters, Lily and Rose, named because David said Margaret had always made everything bloom, were in college. The kind of life that other people point to and say, now that's what hard work looks like. She had not taken a single day for granted. Not one. Which is why, when it started to fall apart, she didn't see it coming. People who work that hard rarely do. They're too busy looking forward to notice what's quietly unraveling behind them. It started with the business. A large wedding contract fell through. Then another. Then a corporate client they'd held for 6 years suddenly moved to a different vendor. Margaret absorbed it, adjusted, took on smaller jobs, cut her own salary first before she'd touch anyone else's. That was who she was. What she didn't know was that while she was trying to save her business, her marriage was quietly bleeding out in the background. David, who had always been easy smiling and steady, had been hiding something from her for 2 years. A second set of financial accounts. Debt, significant debt, accumulated through a series of bad investments he had been too ashamed to tell her about. And another woman, which Margaret found out about the same afternoon the business bank account was frozen due to a creditor claim she didn't know existed. She was sitting at her kitchen table, going through paperwork, when she found both things within 40 minutes of each other. First, the bank notice. Then, the email on the shared computer that she never should have opened, but did, because she was looking for a supplier invoice, and the subject line caught her eye, and she will never, for as long as she lives, forget what it felt like to read those words. She didn't cry, not right away. She sat very still for a very long time. Then she got up, made herself a cup of coffee, drank it standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the 4 acres she had helped pay for, and made a decision. She was not going to become someone who collapsed. But over the next 6 weeks, the ground kept giving way beneath her. The debt David had hidden was tied to the business in ways that made untangling it nearly impossible without legal fees she couldn't afford. The farmhouse had to go towards settlement. Her daughters were devastated, but managing. Her business, the thing she had built with her own 2 hands over 18 years, had to be formally dissolved. When the last meeting with the lawyers ended and she walked out into the parking lot, she had $38 in cash, a duffel bag in the truck, and nowhere to go. She could have gone to her sister's house in Memphis. Her sister had offered 3 times with increasing urgency. She could have called her daughters. She could have called any number of people who would have taken her in without hesitation. Because Margaret Calloway was the kind of woman who had spent 30 years building exactly that kind of goodwill. Instead, she drove north on Interstate 65, then turned off onto a state highway she half remembered from a camping trip she and David had taken early in their marriage, before the children, the kind of road that doesn't get you anywhere quickly. And about 40 minutes later, she turned off again onto a dirt road she didn't remember at all, followed it for 3 miles until the tree cover closed in and the road ended, and she parked her truck. 3 hours she sat in that truck, watching darkness fall, listening to the woods go quiet, thinking about nothing and everything all at once. Then she got out. The first night in the woods was the longest night of Margaret's life. She had her sleeping bag, but she hadn't thought beyond that. She had crackers and a water bottle and the kind of adrenaline that comes from a decision so large and so irreversible that your body doesn't know what else to do but stay awake and process it. She slept under a cedar tree, wrapped in her sleeping bag with her duffel bag pressed against her back for warmth, listening to every sound the forest made. The crack of branches, the distant call of something she couldn't identify, the wind moving through the canopy in long, slow waves. She didn't sleep more than an hour, but when the light came, that soft, grey-blue light that arrives in a Tennessee forest before the sun is actually up, something shifted inside her. She lay there, watching it happen, watching the darkness slowly give way, and she felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Quiet, not silence. The woods were not silent, but inside herself, for the first time in 6 weeks, there was something that resembled quiet. The noise of the lawyers and the paperwork and the phone calls and the grief of David's face when she told him she had nothing left to say to him, all of it receded, just slightly, and in the space it left behind, she could hear herself breathe. She sat up. She looked at the trees around her. She said, out loud, to no one, I have to figure this out. And that was the beginning. Margaret was not a wilderness survival expert. She was a caterer from Clarksville, Tennessee, who knew how to feed 300 people at a black tie event and how to get a souffle right the first time. What she knew about living in the woods could fit on an index card, but she was 55 years old and she had been solving problems her entire life. And the woods, she quickly discovered, were just another problem to be solved. A very large, very complicated, very unforgiving problem, but a problem nonetheless. The first week was brutal. She spent most of it in a fundamental panic she refused to give into, which is different from not feeling it. She felt it constantly, a low-grade electrical current of fear running through everything she did. But she had made a decision to stay, and Margaret Calloway did not unmake decisions. She used her $38 strategically. There was a small general store about 4 miles back down the dirt road, attached to a gas station that looked like it had been there since the Eisenhower administration. An older man named Earl ran it with his wife Dottie, and they sold everything from fishing line to canned soup to work gloves to cheap paperback novels. Margaret went in that first morning and spent carefully: dried beans, rice, salt, a lighter, a cheap tarpaulin, rope, a folding knife, a metal pot, and a small bag of oats. She had $7 left when she walked out. Earl watched her load the truck without comment. Then he called after her. "You camping long?" "A while," she said. He nodded, didn't ask anything else. But the next morning, when she came back to fill her water bottle at the spigot on the side of the building, because she hadn't yet figured out the stream situation, there was a paper bag on the hood of her truck. Inside it was a jar of peanut butter, a box of matches, and a folded piece of paper with a hand-drawn map showing the nearest reliable water source. She stood there in the cold morning air holding that paper bag and cried for the first time since everything fell apart. Not from sadness, from the specific shock of being seen by a stranger when you've been feeling invisible. She never forgot it. By the end of the first week, Margaret had found her water source, a clear, fast-moving creek about a quarter mile into the tree line, and had figured out how to boil water safely. She had rigged the tarpaulin between 4 trees to create a basic shelter, angled to deflect rain, and had built her first real fire using techniques she half remembered from a camping manual she'd read years ago and half invented out of necessity. It was not comfortable, it was barely functional, but it was hers. The second week, she started paying attention. That was the thing Margaret discovered about the woods that nobody had ever told her. If you slow down enough to actually look, the woods will teach you. Not quickly, not easily, but steadily, patiently, the way a very old teacher instructs a very young student, by showing, not telling. She watched how the animals moved and where they went for water. She noticed which plants grew near the creek and which ones appeared only in the dry, elevated spots. She paid attention to the way the wind changed before rain, to the way certain birds went quiet before a storm while others got louder. She started keeping a notebook. She'd had one in her duffel bag, a simple composition notebook she'd been using for business notes, and every evening. In the fading light, she wrote down what she'd observed. It became her most important possession. By the third week, she had found wild onions and identified them correctly by smell and texture. She had located a section of the forest floor dents with chanterelle mushrooms that she recognized because she'd worked with them in her catering kitchen for years. She found persimmon trees loaded with fruit that had just passed peak ripeness and was now fermenting slightly on the branch, which she couldn't eat but noted for next year. Next year. She had started thinking in terms of next year. She hadn't decided to leave. She had also started building. Not because she'd planned to. It started practically. Her tarpaulin shelter was holding up, but barely, and the nights were getting colder as October pushed toward November. She needed something better. She walked the woods looking for fallen timber, for the kind of dry, workable wood that would stack and hold, and what she found instead was a discovery that changed everything. About 1.5 miles into the forest, up a gentle rise she hadn't explored yet, she found the remnants of an old cabin. Not a standing structure, not even close. What was left were 4 low stone walls, none of them taller than 3 feet, arranged in a near-perfect rectangle, roughly 16 feet by 20. The roof was long gone. The interior was choked with decades of leaf fall and saplings, and one enormous blackberry thicket that had taken over the entire south corner. But the stones were good. River stone, mortared together with something that had held through what must have been generations of Tennessee weather. The floor inside was flat. Whoever had built this had chosen the site carefully, sheltered from the north wind by the rise behind it, facing south to catch winter light, with a natural drainage slope away from the foundation. Margaret stood inside those walls for a long time. She wasn't thinking about survival anymore. She was thinking about the person who had built this, who they were, what their life had looked like inside these walls. Whether they had stood in this exact spot on a morning exactly like this one and felt the same strange combination of terror and possibility that she felt right now. Then she thought, I can work with this. What Margaret built over the next 3 months was something between a miracle and an act of pure stubborn human will. She had no power tools. She had her folding knife, a hatchet she found in the ruins of the old cabin, buried under 2 feet of leaf matter and badly rusted but structurally sound, and the physical strength of a woman who had been hauling equipment and working on her feet for 30 years. She cleared the interior of the stone walls first. That alone took 11 days. The blackberry thicket fought her every single morning, and she fought it back, and she did not stop. Her hands were cut, and her back ached, and there were mornings she woke before dawn, so stiff she had to lie still for 10 minutes before she could move. She moved anyway. She used the cleared saplings and the thicket wood for her first real fire structure, a proper fire ring inside the old cabin's footprint, positioned where she could see the chimney stones still embedded in the north wall. Someone had built a fireplace there once. The chimney was gone, but the stones that had framed the firebox were still there, still solid. She rebuilt around them. It took her 4 days, and she redid sections of it twice because the drawer wasn't right. But when she finally got a fire going in that rebuilt firebox and watched the smoke pull correctly up and away, she sat down in the dirt and pressed her forehead against her knees and allowed herself 30 seconds of complete, uncomplicated joy. 30 seconds. Then she got up. She used fallen timber for the roof structure. She was not a carpenter. She did not have a carpenter's vocabulary, or a carpenter's tools, or a carpenter's certainty about load-bearing angles. But she had her notebook, where she had started sketching structural ideas the way she used to sketch menus, iteratively, practically, working through problems on paper before committing them to reality. She had physics she remembered vaguely from high school. And she had Earl. On her weekly trips to the general store for supplies, she had begun doing odd jobs for Earl and Dottie in exchange for food and materials, washing windows, organizing the storage room, helping Dottie can the last of the fall tomatoes. She started asking questions. Earl, it turned out, had been a carpenter before his back gave out. He didn't ask why she was building. He just answered her questions. What's the simplest roof structure that sheds water? How do you notch logs so they lock? What do you fill gaps with when you don't have mortar? How deep do your drainage channels need to be? Earl answered every single one. Sometimes he drew pictures on the back of paper bags. Sometimes he walked her out to his own barn and pointed at the ceiling. Once, he drove her to an abandoned property 2 miles down the road and showed her how a collapsed roof had failed, where the critical joints had given way so she'd know what not to do. He never offered to come and help her build it. She never asked him to. There was a mutual understanding between them that was never spoken aloud. This was something she had to do herself. She understood it too. By the time the first real cold arrived, mid-November, a night that dropped to 19 degrees and left a glaze of ice on the creek by morning, Margaret had a roof. It was not a beautiful roof. It was logs notched and stacked and covered with layers of bark and pine bough, and a sheet of heavy-gauge plastic sheeting Earl had given her from a roll he said he had no use for, all of it weighted down with more logs. But it was tight enough and it kept the rain out, and when the fire was going. The interior of that 16 by 20 stone room held heat in a way that made her feel, for the first time since she'd walked into these woods, something close to safe. She lay in her sleeping bag that first truly cold night, with the fire burning low, and the ice forming outside, and the wind moving through the tree canopy above the cabin, and she felt something shift inside her again. Something deeper this time than the quiet she'd felt on that first morning. She felt capable. Not confident, not healed, not okay in any complete sense of the word, but capable. The specific, grounded, bone-deep knowledge that she could do hard things, that she had always been able to do hard things, and that the hardest thing she'd ever faced, the loss of her marriage and her business and her home, and the identity she'd built around all three, had not, in fact, destroyed her. It had just relocated her. She wrote in her notebook that night by firelight until she couldn't keep her eyes open. Not observations about the woods, not structural sketches, just thoughts, memories, the story of her own life, written down for the first time in her own words, with no audience and no purpose except the act of writing it. She filled 14 pages that night. Winter in those Tennessee woods was not merciful. Margaret did not romanticize it then, and she does not romanticize it now. It was the hardest physical experience of her life, and there were days, real days. Not just moments, but full days, when the cold and the isolation and the sheer relentlessness of it pressed down on her like a weight she wasn't sure she could hold. There was a week in January when the temperature didn't climb above 12 degrees for 7 straight days, and her creek froze solid, and she had to melt snow for water over a fire she had to keep burning around the clock, which meant sleeping in short intervals and waking to feed it, and sleeping again. She went through her wood supply in 4 days and had to venture out in the cold to gather more, which she did every single day in layers of clothing she had accumulated through a combination of Earl's charity and Dottie's spare winter things pressed on her without comment one afternoon when she came in from the cold looking, Dottie said later, like something the cat dragged in. There was a night she got turned around in the dark, coming back from the woodpile she'd built 50 yards from the cabin, and had to stand still in the black cold and talk herself back, to calm with the methodical logic of, you know where the wind comes from, you know where the slope goes, you know where the firelight is. Find the firelight. She found it. It was 30 feet to her left. She walked to it and went inside and did not go out again until morning. There was a Sunday in February when she sat by the fire and did not speak and did not move and did not do anything except sit and stare at the flames for 6 hours, because the grief of her old life came for her that day in a way she couldn't reason with or work through or distract herself from. It just came. David's face on the day they got married. Her daughters as babies, small and warm and smelling like something so good she could still conjure it 23 years later. The farmhouse kitchen, where she had cooked 1,000 meals and tested 1,000 recipes and stood at the window watching the sun go down over 4 acres of land that was no longer hers. She let herself feel all of it, every piece of it. She didn't run from it or minimize it or tell herself to be strong. She just sat with it for 6 hours and let it move through her, the way you let a storm move through, not by standing against it, but by being still enough that it can pass. When it passed, she was hungry. She made herself a pot of bean soup. She ate it. She washed the pot. She went to sleep. The next morning, she got up and kept going. Spring came the way spring always comes in Tennessee, suddenly, insistently, like a guest who arrives before you've finished getting ready. One week the world was grey and frozen, and the next it was exploding in every direction, the trees budding, the creek unfreezing and swelling with snowmelt, the birds arriving in great noisy waves that woke Margaret before dawn and made her smile before she was fully conscious. She had made it through the winter, She stood outside the cabin on the first genuinely warm morning, late March. The sun actually carrying heat for the first time in months, and looked at what she had built and felt something she struggled to name. Pride felt too small. Relief felt too simple. What she felt was something like wonder, directed not outward at the woods, but inward at herself. At the woman who had walked in here with $38 and a sleeping bag and had somehow, through stubbornness and Earl's paper bag diagrams and 14 pages of firelit writing and one very long Sunday of grief, made it to the other side. She started to think about what came next. Not leaving. She wasn't ready to leave, and she had, by this point, stopped expecting herself to be. Something about the woods had gotten into her in a way she didn't fully understand yet, but trusted. She had things to figure out that you couldn't figure out anywhere else. The woods had taught her that much, that there was a kind of thinking you could only do when you removed yourself from the noise of everything you'd always been, everything you'd always had to be. So she stayed. And in the staying, she started to build something else entirely. It began with the notebook. By spring, she had filled 3 of them. Earl sold them at the store, simple composition notebooks, 50 cents each. In the first one were her observations about the woods, plant identification, weather patterns, animal behavior, water management. In the second were her structural sketches and building notes. In the third was everything else, her memories, her grief, her realizations, the slow and painful and ultimately liberating process of understanding what her marriage had actually been, what her business had actually meant to her, what she had built versus what had been built around her without her consent. She read back through all 3 notebooks one afternoon in early April, sitting outside the cabin in the first real spring warmth, and something crystallized. She had, without meaning to, been writing a book. Not a memoir exactly, not a self-help guide exactly, something between and beyond both. The story of a woman who lost everything and went to the woods, and what the woods taught her about surviving, about building, about grief, about the difference between the life you've been living and the life that is actually yours. She sat with that realization for a full week before she did anything about it. Then she drove her truck to the library in the nearest town, 18 miles, the first time she'd driven that far since autumn, and she sat at one of the public computers for 4 hours and she started to research. She researched self-publishing. She researched the market for survival memoirs, for women's recovery narratives, for books about voluntary simplicity and building with your hands. She researched what it took to turn a composition notebook full of handwritten pages into something people could read. She researched because Margaret Calloway had always done her homework. Here is the thing about Margaret that you need to understand. The business she had built and lost, the events company, the catering operation, the thing she had grown from a church kitchen to an 11-person enterprise, had not actually been what she loved. It had been what she was good at. Those are not the same thing, and she had confused them for a very long time. What Margaret loved was feeding people. Not in the logistical, large-scale, business efficiency sense that the events company had eventually required. She loved the act of cooking for someone, the care in it, the intimacy of it, the specific joy of watching someone eat something you made and seeing their face change. She loved growing things, which she had done in the farmhouse garden, and then less and less as the business took over more of her time. She loved being outside. She loved silence and early mornings, and the feeling of physical work completed. She had been living, for years, almost entirely away from the things she loved. Building something successful that did not actually feed her. Working so hard to keep everything standing that she'd never stopped to ask whether she wanted all of it standing. The woods had given her back the thing she loved. Not gently. The woods are not gentle, but completely. There was no distance from it in here, No buffer of staff and events and logistics and the performance of success. There was just her and the ground and the fire and the food she foraged and cooked over that rebuilt Firebox, and every single meal was an act of pure intention. Nothing else. She wrote about this in the notebook. At length. With a clarity she had not experienced in years, and when she drove to the library that April afternoon and sat at the computer and researched and thought and eventually opened a blank document and started to type, what came out was not a survival manual or a how-to guide or an advice book. It was a love letter. To the woods, yes, but more than that, to the life she hadn't known she was capable of, the one that had been waiting for her on the other side of everything she'd lost. She typed for 3 hours without stopping. When she got in the truck to drive back, she felt lighter than she had in a very long time. Maybe longer than she could remember. Over the next 4 months, Margaret divided her life between the cabin and the library. 3 or 4 times a week, she drove the 18 miles into town, worked at the computer for as many hours as she could, then drove back. Earl and Dottie, who had become something between employers and family during the winter, let her use their Wi-Fi connection on the days she couldn't make it to town. She sat at their small kitchen table with a borrowed laptop and typed, and Dottie brought her coffee and didn't ask questions, and Earl sometimes read over her shoulder and once said, quietly, "That's real." That is, before going back to the store. She was writing the book. She was also, simultaneously, building the rest of the cabin's infrastructure. A proper door. She found solid timber. She built it herself. It took 3 attempts, and she was quietly triumphant about the third. A simple sleeping loft that Earl's diagrams helped her frame correctly so it would hold without sagging. A storage shelf system along the north wall. A proper outdoor kitchen space with a second fire pit and a clay and stone surround she mixed and set herself, based on a technique she found described in an old book about traditional building that the library had in its small rural history section. She also started a garden. A real one, planned the way she had always planned menus, with consideration for what would grow together, what would feed her through multiple seasons, what the soil in this particular spot could support. She dug beds inside the old stone footprint that was too small for the cabin and lined them with the creek stones she had been collecting since spring. She sourced seeds, some from Dottie's own garden, some from a seed exchange at the library, some from Earl's store. She planted them in late April and tended them with the same attention she had once given to the logistics of feeding 300 people at a gala, except that this time the attention was entirely hers and entirely quiet. She grew tomatoes and beans and 3 varieties of squash and kale and chard and herbs in quantity, basil, thyme, oregano, rosemary. A mint that ran a little wild and that she didn't mind. By midsummer, the garden was producing more than she could eat alone, and she began bringing vegetables to Earl's store to sell, an arrangement Earl suggested with characteristic practicality. You grow it, I'll sell it. We split it 60-40. She grew more. The book was finished in August. Not polished, she knew that, but complete. Every chapter that needed to be there was there. Every piece of the story had been told. She had written about the morning she found the old cabin walls, about the first fire, about the week the temperature didn't break 12 degrees, about the Sunday she sat by the fire and let herself grieve without fighting it. She had written about Earl and his paper bag diagrams and Dottie's spare winter clothes. She had written about what it felt like to eat food she had grown herself after a winter of eating what she could forage and what she could afford. She had written about the specific, unglamorous, utterly transformative experience of doing hard physical work alone in the woods and discovering that you are more capable than anyone, including yourself, had ever told you. She had also written about David, not with bitterness, That surprised her when she read it back. She had written about him with the kind of clear-eyed understanding that only comes from enough distance, enough silence, enough time spent in the company of your own thoughts, without anywhere to run from them. She wrote about what she had contributed to the slow erosion of the marriage, and what had simply been his choices and his failures, and the difference between those two things, and why understanding the difference mattered. She had written about her daughters, Lily and Rose, who she had spoken to by phone every Sunday throughout the year. Those calls had been the lifeline she didn't talk about in polite company, but which had sustained her through some of the hardest weeks. They had been worried about her in the beginning, deeply, vocally worried. By spring they had shifted to something closer to awed, though neither of them would have used that word. By summer, Lily had driven out to see her and had stood in the doorway of the cabin Margaret had built and said nothing for a long time, and then said, "Mum, this is you. This is all the way you." The book was finished in August. She drove to the library and she printed the whole manuscript, 218 pages, and she sat in the parking lot reading the first chapter and the last chapter back to back, and she cried, and then she drove home. She published it herself. She had researched how. It took her 3 months to format it, to design a cover using a photograph she took herself at dawn outside the cabin, the stone walls, the morning light filtering through the tree canopy, the garden visible in the background, her own figure small and upright in the frame, and to work through the logistics of self-publishing that, 6 months ago, would have felt impossibly technical, and now felt like any other problem to be solved step by step. She titled it, "The Year I Built Something Real." She told no one when it went live. Not Earl, not Dottie, not her daughters. She published it on a Tuesday morning from the library computer, then drove back to the cabin and made herself breakfast from the last of the summer tomatoes and a handful of the kale that was still going strong in the October cool. And she ate it sitting in the doorway of the cabin she had built with her own hands, looking out at the woods that had taught her how to survive and then how to live, and she felt, fully and without qualification, at peace. She was not expecting what happened next. The book found its first readers slowly, the way real things always do. A woman in Oregon who had been through a divorce found it through a search for books about starting over. She left a review that was 4 paragraphs long and ended with the sentence, "I didn't know I needed this book until I was already crying through the last chapter." Another reader in Kentucky, a man who had lost his farm and his livelihood in a flood, found it through a grief support forum where someone had posted the link with the note, "This isn't a sad book, I promise. It's the opposite." A librarian in Vermont added it to her recommended reading list and mentioned it in a newsletter. By December, 13 months after Margaret had parked her truck at the edge of the woods and walked away from everything, the book had sold 1,200 copies. Not a bestseller. Not by any conventional measure a remarkable number. But 1,200 people had read the story of what she had built in the woods, and a significant portion of them had written to her about it. Through the contact form she had set up on a simple author website that Lily helped her build on a visit in October. The letters were what changed her, not the sales. The letters. A woman who had just been diagnosed with cancer wrote to say the book had given her the language for something she didn't know how to say, that being stripped of everything you thought you were could be the beginning of finding out who you actually are. A veteran wrote to say he had been sleeping in his car for 3 months when someone left the book on the seat, and he had read it in one sitting and gone to the VA the next morning for the first time. A retired teacher in New Mexico wrote to say she had given the book to every woman in her book club, and they had spent 2 hours crying together, and 2 more hours talking about what they would do if they had to start over, and what they discovered in that conversation was that most of them already wanted to. Margaret read every letter, she replied to every one. And in replying, in sitting with these strangers and their private losses and their questions, and their tentative hope, something clarified in her that had been forming slowly all year. A new direction. Not a return to the events company, not a reconstruction of the old life. Something entirely new, built the way the cabin had been built, from the ground up, with what she had, one stone at a time. She called it groundwork. A retreat and teaching space in the woods, not a luxury operation. Not a spa rebranded as wilderness experience, but a genuine working place where people came to build things with their hands, to cook real food from a real garden, to sleep in simple structures and wake before dawn and work through the day and talk at night around a fire about the things they were carrying and the things they were afraid to put down. The idea arrived whole in her head one evening in December as she was rereading a letter from a woman in Georgia who had written, "I wish there was somewhere I could actually go to do what you did. Not to live in the woods forever, just to remember that I can do hard things." Margaret sat with that for a long time. Then she wrote back to the woman in Georgia and said, "I'm building it. Come when it's ready." It wasn't bravado, it was just what felt true. She spent the winter planning it the way she had spent the previous winter surviving, methodically, resourcefully, one problem at a time. She walked the land around the cabin, which she had by now established that she had the right to use through a conversation with the county land office that turned out to be far simpler than she'd expected. The parcel was owned by an estate that had been inactive for decades, and the executor was a property lawyer in Nashville who, when Margaret contacted him to explain what she was doing and ask about a lease arrangement, was so surprised by the call that he offered her a nominal rent agreement almost immediately. She spent the winter scouting sites, sketching layouts, figuring out what she could build herself and what she would need help with. She called her daughters, who were both practical women, raised by a practical woman, and laid out what she was thinking. There was a pause on the line, and then Lily said, "Tell me what you need," and Rose said, "I'm coming down in February to help plan." She applied for a small business grant through a rural entrepreneurship program she'd found through the library's resources, the kind of program that most people don't know exists, designed specifically for small enterprises in rural communities. She was awarded $6,000, which was not a large amount of money, but which, to a woman who had survived a Tennessee winter on $38, felt like an extraordinary resource. She went back to Earl with a business proposition. Would he and Dottie consider supplying the retreat operation with basic goods, with her garden supplying most of the food and Earl's store providing what she couldn't grow? Earl read the one-page summary she'd written, handed it back, and said, "Dottie and I talked about whether something like this was coming. We're in." She started building the first additional sleeping structure in March, almost exactly a year after she had walked out into that first warm spring morning and looked at what she'd built through the winter and felt wonder. She opened groundwork in June. 6 sleeping spaces, 4 she built herself, 2 with help from Earl and a neighbour of his who turned out to be a retired builder, happy to work for fair wages and someone to talk to in the afternoons. A communal kitchen space attached to an expanded version of the original cabin. The garden, which had been producing for 2 seasons and was large enough by now to supply most of what she needed. A fire circle surrounded by log seating. A small building she called the workshop, where she kept the tools and where she taught what she called construction mornings, 2 hours every day, learning to build something with your hands, something simple and real and yours. The first group was 8 women. They came from 5 different states. One had recently lost her husband to illness. One had just left a marriage of 30 years. One was 29 years old and had simply, she said when they went around the fire on the first night, always felt like she was living someone else's idea of her life and needed to stop. One was 68 and had been, before retirement, a corporate attorney who said she hadn't used her hands for anything more physical than a keyboard in 40 years and found she could no longer stand that about herself. Margaret cooked for them. She taught them to build. She walked them through the woods the way the woods had walked her through the year. Slowly, attentively, with respect for what they didn't know yet and trust in what they were capable of learning. On the last night, around the fire, each of them said something they were taking home. The 29-year-old said, "I remembered that I'm not afraid of hard things." The woman who had lost her husband said, "I think I can breathe again." The former attorney looked into the fire for a long moment and then said, "I want to build something. I don't know what yet, but I'm going to." Margaret listened to all of it. She said very little. It wasn't her place that night to say much. It was her place to have built the fire and to have made the food and to have created the space where these things could be said. It was enough, more than enough. In the 2 years that followed, groundwork grew slowly and deliberately, the way Margaret had come to believe everything worth growing must grow. She didn't scale it fast. She didn't take investors. She didn't franchise it or license it or attempt to replicate it somewhere more accessible. She kept it in those woods, in those stone walls, around that rebuilt firebox. In the garden that expanded by one new bed each season. The book continued to find readers. A year after publication, it had sold just over 9,000 copies, still not a bestseller in any traditional sense, but a steady, growing thing. The kind of book that passed from hand to hand with a note tucked inside. A profile in a small regional magazine led to a mention in a larger national publication. And that led to an invitation to speak at a women's conference in Atlanta, which Margaret almost turned down because public speaking at scale had never been her thing, but which she ultimately accepted because the theme of the conference was rebuilding, and she felt she had something true to say about that. She said it. People listened. 3 months after the Atlanta conference, Groundwork had a waiting list. Not a massive one. She was operating at a small, intentional scale and intended to keep it that way. But a waiting list. Real demand. People who had specifically sought her out, specifically sought this experience, because they needed what she had learned how to provide. She hired help for the first time, a young woman named Clara who had attended one of the early retreats and who asked on the last day if she could come back and work, who was exactly the kind of practical, curious, willing person that Margaret recognized from a mirror. Clara ran the booking logistics and the supply coordination and freed Margaret to do what she was actually there to do: teach. Cook, build, and sit with people at the end of the day and listen to what they were carrying. The money was not enormous. It was not the revenue of the events company at its height, but it was consistent and growing, and it was entirely, completely, without qualification hers, not built on debt that was hidden from her, not dependent on relationships that could unravel, not attached to an identity that had been constructed from the outside in. It was built the way the cabin had been built, stone by stone. Hers. Margaret turned 58 in November of the retreat's second year. She spent the day doing exactly what she would have done on any other day. She got up before light and made coffee and walked to the creek and stood there listening to the water in the dark. She made breakfast. She tended the garden, which was going dormant for winter. She worked on a new structure she was adding to the property, a small library space, enclosed and warm, where guests could sit in the evening and read and write in their own notebooks. She ate dinner alone that night by the fire in the original cabin, the one she had built from stone walls and rotten timber and paper bag diagrams and $38, and she thought about the night she had parked her truck at the edge of this forest and sat in the dark for 3 hours. She thought about what she had believed about herself then, that she was finished, that whatever she had been, she was no longer, that the life she was leaving was the only life she had known how to build, and she had run out of road. She had been so wrong, not wrong in a way that was her fault, Wrong the way you can only be wrong about something you've never had reason to test. She had never had reason to test herself like this before. She had never had occasion to find out what was actually underneath all the things she'd built around herself. What was left when you took it all away? What was left was considerable. What was left was, in fact, more than she had ever had access to, when it was all buried under the business and the farmhouse and the marriage and the identity of woman who had made it, who had built something, who was successful in all the ways that could be pointed to and measured. What was left was Margaret. She is still there. If you drove that dirt road today, you would find the original cabin with its rebuilt firebox and its sleeping loft and its proper door. The third attempt, the one that finally hung right. You would find 6 additional sleeping structures, each one built differently, each one carrying the signature of whoever built it, because that is part of how Margaret teaches. You don't build what she tells you to build, you build what you need to build, and she teaches you how. You would find the garden in whatever season you arrived, green and explosive in summer, bare and resting in winter, between in spring and fall, always tended, always honest. You would find the workshop with its tools lined up on the wall and sawdust on the floor. You would find the small library space with its wood stove and its shelves of books and the notebooks stacked near the door for guests who arrive without one. You would find Earl's truck sometimes parked near the entrance because Earl and Dottie are there for dinner once a month without exception, and Dottie always brings something Dottie made, and Earl always reads whatever is pinned to the workshop wall, which is usually a drawing or a letter or a piece of writing from a recent guest. And Earl always says something quietly true about it before going to sit by the fire. And you would find Margaret. Not the Margaret who ran an 11-person events company, not the Margaret who had a farmhouse and a 27-year marriage and a professional identity she had carefully constructed over 30 years. Not the Margaret who sat in a truck at the edge of a forest with $38 and nowhere to go. The Margaret who is there now is something else. Something built from all of those versions. Yes, she contains all of them. She would be the first to tell you that you don't get to subtract your history from yourself, that it is all of it material, even the painful parts, especially the painful parts. But she is not defined by any of them. She is defined by what she chose to do with all of it. She walks into those woods every morning before the guests are up. She stands by the creek and listens to it, and she thinks about the woman who stood there years ago in the grey pre-dawn light and heard, for the first time in a very long time, her own thoughts. She is grateful for the loss. Not because the loss was good. It wasn't good, not all of it, not at the time, but because of what the loss made room for. She has said this at the fire more than once. She has said it to women who were fresh enough in their grief that the words felt like a strange language, one they couldn't quite translate yet. She says it anyway. Because the translation comes. It comes when you're ready for it, and it comes faster if someone has already said the words out loud and left them hanging in the air for you to find. The best thing that ever happened to Margaret Calloway was the day she lost everything. She walked into the woods. And she built something real. If you're sitting somewhere right now, feeling like the ground has shifted under you, like you've lost something so fundamental that you don't know how to be upright without it, I want you to hear this. What Margaret learned in those woods was not that the loss didn't matter. It mattered enormously. Every piece of it. What she learned was that you are not the things you've built around yourself. You are what does the building. And you can always build again. The fire doesn't care who you used to be. It only cares whether you tend it. Margaret learned to tend it. So can you.